So thank you for inviting me to speak at this seminar. My name is Blair Kaneshiro. I'm currently at Stanford University, and my talk today will be kind of honing in on the Datasets part of this initiative, and I'll be talking about facilitating interdisciplinary music research through open data. So just to give a little outline of my talk, I'll start by just briefly introducing myself and the research group at CCRMA, Stanford, that I'm a part of. From there, I'll move to this notion of data as a scientific contribution. And then we'll kind of zoom into a couple of example data sets from the Mary group and how their release has been facilitating scientific discovery by other researchers. I'll talk briefly about how our group is thinking about data, not only in relation to research, but also as a starting point for teaching. And then I'll conclude with our group's continuing efforts, as well as just some general advice for people who might be interested in doing more data sharing themselves. So just to get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm currently based at Stanford University in California. I have two affiliations at Stanford. So I'm an adjunct professor at CCRMA in the music department, and I work primarily with the Mary group, which I'll talk about in just a moment. I'm also a staff researcher in the Graduate School of Education as part of the Educational Neuroscience Initiative. So how did I get here? I've done a lot with Stanford over the past decades. So I started out as an undergrad in music. I continued eventually to add a master's and a PhD in music at Stanford. Along the way, I also did a master's degree in electrical engineering. I did my postdoc at Stanford at the Center for the Study of Language and Information. And after that, I was a research scientist in otolaryngology in Stanford School of Medicine. And I've also worked in industry. So I worked at Shazam while I was doing my PhD. And I also worked at Smule in between my two most recent Stanford appointments. My areas of research are somewhat interdisciplinary, or fairly interdisciplinary. So one area that I work in is music information retrieval, or MIR. I am especially interested in the human aspects of MIR. And so some of my topics in this area include user studies around social music behaviors, most often collaborative playlists, which often involve Spotify users. When I was at Shazam, I did some work on understanding people's behaviors around music discovery. Through my collaborations with the Mary group, we've also worked on a couple of interfaces related to beat perception and production. And most recently, I'm part of some exciting collaborations about fandoms, specifically BTS. On the other side of my research, I am also a neuroscientist. I work with electroencephalography, or EEG. And in this area, I do a few things. So I've done a lot of work in multivariate decoding, also known as EEG classification. More recently, I've started working with neural correlation, which refers to a group of methods that enable us to use ecologically valid music stimuli. And I'm also interested in general in developing and using modern methods for analyzing brain data. And alongside this, I'm involved in some software development. And as I'll talk about today, I'm interested in EEG data sets. And so at the intersection of these two areas is a line of research that I'm on that's related to neural processing of real world music. And it's these data sets that I'll be focusing on in my talk today. So as I mentioned, I'm at CCRMA as part of the Music Engagement Research Initiative, or MARY. And what MARY is an interdisciplinary research group based at CCRMA. And we have a very broad goal. So our goal is to increase our understanding of how and why humans engage with music. And in our group, we have a lot of researchers and collaborators, both within Stanford and from other institutions. And we collectively have a wide variety of backgrounds, both in music, but also in related fields, such as psychology, engineering, medicine, and most recently, education. And as you can imagine, musical engagement is a very broad topic. And what we've ended up doing is approaching this topic through a variety of different research questions and also approaches. So this is just a subset of the topics that we look at. And what I'll be talking about today is mainly this middle part, which is research tools and data sets. And this topic actually informs and results from a lot of the other topics that our group is thinking about. So I'm now going to switch gears a little bit and think about how data can be a scientific contribution. So as many of us know, in recent years, a lot of publications and funding agencies have started to require that researchers release or at least make available their scientific data. And this kind of relates to the reproducibility, replicability crisis. And for us, I actually first encountered this in 2015 when we were getting ready to submit a paper to PLOS One. And upon seeing this requirement, we ultimately decided that we would kind of take the plunge and release an EEG data set for the first time. And so what happened with this is that we utilized our university's data repository and we deposited our EEG data. This was actually not for a music paper. This was for a paper about visual object categories. And we just kind of put in the data that was right before we analyzed it. And we just gave it a title that related to the title of the paper. And that was kind of our first data deposit. But after we did this, we started having some conversations within our group about what it meant to share data and how we might do it better. So we started asking ourselves some questions about, what if we were more intentional about data sharing? So what if we didn't just kind of put in a set of data matrices, but maybe curated it a little bit better? Along those lines, what if we put more effort into making the data easy for others to use? And ultimately, we were asking ourselves, what if every study had at least a discussion around releasing data? So first, we figure out whether it's possible or appropriate to release the data. And if it is, maybe we put some real effort into preparing the data, create our own internal process for doing so, and integrate that into our research and publication pipeline. And so that's eventually what we did. So if we kind of think about it in terms of this kind of simplistic research pipeline, which I have here, to do an end-to-end study, it really requires a lot, right? So you first need the lab and the infrastructure to perform the research. You need personnel who are trained in every stage of the research. You need a study that you've designed. You need to collect the data, and then you need to clean the data and then analyze the data. And this pipeline also continues to extend to interpreting and drawing conclusions from your data. So here in the Mary group, we are set up to do an end-to-end EEG study. So we have all these things, but not everybody has all of these things. And so what we ended up doing is identifying 2 release points for our data that might make it usable by other researchers. So our first release point is raw data. So in an EEG experiment, you typically record participants in sessions and you have continuous recordings. And so the raw data is anonymized continuous EEG records. And we thought that researchers who work a lot with EEG and maybe have their own full cleaning and analysis pipelines would be interested in this data. Our second release point is clean data. So this is after we filtered the data, epoched it, cleaned out artifacts, and aggregated it. And what's happening here is that researchers who may or may not be EEG researchers, maybe they're engineers who have algorithms that are trying to solve problems related to music, they might benefit from having ready-to-use data that they can go right into analysis with. And so these researchers would kind of jump right into this last stage. And we anticipated that by releasing these forms of data, that some researchers would end up drawing scientific insights from the continuous data, some from the ready-to-use data. And, we ourselves also tend to do more than one analysis of our data. So in all, we posit that releasing data could actually facilitate scientific progress, because what we're getting is all of these contributions that we would not or could not have made ourselves. So I'll now kind of talk about the data sets that the Mary group has been invested in, and I'll do a deeper dive into a couple of our EEG data sets. So in Mary, we actually do release a substantial amount of data and other research tools. So if we kind of look at the timeline of the group, there are a few categories of data that have emerged over the past decade. So the first category is EEG data. So our first data set was a data set of chord progressions. And since then, we've released a variety of data sets under this NMED classification, which stands for Naturalistic Music EEG data set. We've also released a data set of people tapping to songs. Through our industry collaborations, there have been a few different data sets that have come out. And finally, a little bit out of the scope for today's topic, but we also do develop and release research software. And so for today, I'm going to focus on these naturalistic music EEG data sets with a special focus on the NMED-H and the NMED-T, since those were the two big data sets that we first released. So with the naturalistic music EEG data sets, they are all linked to a study or intended to be linked to a study at some point. We've been collecting this kind of data, I guess, since 2014 or so. So our first data set came out in 2016. That one had 48 participants listening to full-length Bollywood songs. So this is related to our neural correlation research. So we're actually able to present these full-length musical works in all their complexity and ecological validity. Following the Hindi data set in 2017, we released the NMED-T, which was actually released as a data set paper, but was designed for people who might be interested in studying beat processing and tempo processing in natural music. In 2018, we released some pilot data that we had collected with shorter Bollywood excerpts. And then last year, we released two more data sets, one of which is related to Elgar's cello concerto. And then we did a minimalism data set as well, which is centered around an excerpt of a pretty famous performance of Piano Phase by Steve Reich. And as you can see, the data sets all kind of link to a manuscript or published paper. So what's in these data sets? So these are all EEG data. So we work with the 128 channel system of the electrical geodesics platform. And these are all anonymized data sets. So you cannot figure out whose data it is by accessing our data sets. And as I mentioned in my previous slide, we release the EEG data in two forms. So we have the ready-to-use EEG data, which are already cleaned and aggregated by stimulus. So essentially what a researcher can do is they can just, retrieve the data, and each stimulus corresponds to a three-dimensional data matrix that's electrodes by time by trial. And then we also release the continuous raw recordings, which are not clean. We document all of our non-pilot data sets with information on the stimuli and the variables and how the data were collected. And all of our data sets also have some form of behavioral responses. So we usually ask participants to rate the stimuli along various dimensions after they hear them. The NMED-T data set also has tapping responses where people were tapping along to the beat in a separately from the EEG data recording. And then the minimalism data set also has participants, again, in a separate listen, reporting their level of engagement with each stimulus as they heard it. So that's kind of what's in the data. Here's a little bit of information about how we go about releasing it. So at this point, we now aim to release every data set that we collect eventually. And usually the data are collected for a specific study. So in most cases, there will be responses to not only the original intact music, but also to some control versions which have been manipulated in some way. So for instance, the Hindi data set has the original music. It also has responses to each song played backwards, each song scrambled at the measure level, and also a phase scrambled version. The exception to this is the NMED-T data set, which has more songs only in their intact versions, since that one was more focused on tempo than on intact versus control stimuli. We don't release the data right after we record it. So typically what we're doing now is that when we have a first research contribution that we want to make publicly available, that's when we publish the data. So, one data set was released when my thesis came out. Otherwise, we typically post the data when we post the preprint. And that's usually when we're doing a paper submission. And then as for repositories, we're really lucky at Stanford that Stanford has its own data repository, which just integrates licensing, the permanent URL, which is something that journals often ask for when you're submitting a manuscript and have to make a data statement, and then its own standalone citation. And there are other services that provide this as well. So the Izmir community uses Zenodo a lot. There's also Open Science Framework and other services that are available and free. So just kind of focusing in on our first two data sets, the NMED-H and the NMED-T. The NMED-H was originally collected and released alongside my thesis in 2016 and later turned into a journal paper. The NMED-T data set was released as a data set paper in an Izmir paper in 2017, led by Stephen Lassarelli. Our group also reused the NMED-H data set to study stimulus response correlation using canonical correlation analysis in a 2017 Izmir paper that was led by Nick Gang. So if we had not released our data, this would be kind of what came out of it, which, it's fine, but there's more that came out of it. So this is just based on a brief search, so it might not be everything that's come out, but I have found that the NMED-H data have been used by Kati and Ganapati in 2021 to actually extend the stimulus response correlation from a linear CCA to deep CCA. The NMED-T dataset, meanwhile, has been used by a number of groups. So Andre Offner and Sebastian Stober have used it for a few studies, including looking at EEG-based music reconstruction, modeling expectancy and surprise, and also using EEG to inform a predictive coding model. Vinay et al. Have used the NMED-T dataset to study musical onset detection from EEG, while Kim and Lee and colleagues have used it to perform tempo classification. Finally, a recent paper by Ramirez, Aristizabal et al. Have used both datasets in conjunction to do an image-based song classification using EEG. And so I'll just pause here and point out that our group would never have done all of these things. So we don't work in all of these topics. We don't have all of the skill sets that these other researchers have. And even in cases where we're interested in the similar topic, so for instance, we are interested in tempo classification from EEG, we would have used vastly different methods than Kim and Lee had used to approach this problem. And so I know that there's always some worry with data release and even with preprints that, you know, someone might scoop you or do the thing that you were going to do. At least from our limited experience, we're finding that that's highly unlikely, and that even a same topic does not mean that it turns into the same research contribution. So that was kind of a look at how our research data sets are doing in the area of research. We also think about data in terms of teaching. And so I'll just give a couple examples of what we've been doing. So CCRMA has a course that I've taught in the past called Data-Driven Research in Music Cognition. And what this course is about is kind of thinking about data and research in maybe a non-traditional way that music science researchers often think about hypothesis formulation and asking research questions. So many of us in music cognition and music neuroscience, you know, we learn how to design studies around a specific research question and then collect data to answer that question. And what this course was doing was actually thinking about things in the opposite direction. So given an existing data set, what scientific questions can we ask of it? How do we go about answering that question? And what are the limitations of using pre-existing data? And so this was also a fairly interdisciplinary course. So there would be a lot of CCRMA students, but also students from other departments at Stanford. And this course was more centered around industry data and MIR data sets. And so as part of the course too, we had set up some industry data sharing agreements, and sometimes people from those companies would participate as project mentors or guest speakers. And so this class has been on hiatus for a while, but it was really exciting to see that some of the class projects or data used in the teaching materials did find their way into being released as ISMIR late-breaking demo papers, also as full-length ISMIR papers, and then as peer-reviewed papers in other venues. Also for integration with teaching, I'm now using the NMED-T dataset as part of a neuroscience instruction that I'm engaged in. And so I'm in the process of developing a curriculum around neural correlation. So neural correlation is the reason that we've been collecting these naturalistic music EEG datasets. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm integrating the data set into a series of self-paced coding modules. So we had a weekly group that would meet, and each student or researcher in the group would choose a song from the data set, and then that would be kind of their song for the whole coding group. And what they would do is they would run the EEG data for that song through a series of code examples. And this was really nice because every student was performing the same analyses, but since they were each working with a different song, they each had different insights and interpretations that they could relate back to the musical content of the song that they were analyzing. And practically speaking, by using a validated data set, it was a way to onboard the researchers in the EdNeuro group into this type of analysis. So, performing the analyses, interpreting the results, and doing those documentation, writing aspects of research. And by doing so first, when they start doing their own studies, they're already set up to perform the analyses on new data. And so this kind of had its own little ecosystem where, we would meet weekly. I would present slides on the method that we were working on that week. And then after that, the students would access an assignment in conjunction with the code that was already prepared. And then they would write up their results and we would discuss that as a group. All right, so we're now in my concluding section. So I just want to kind of revisit our research pipeline and access. So our goal in doing these data releases really is to facilitate the progress of science. So we conjectured that by releasing our experimental data, that other researchers might make use of the data and make scientific contributions that exceed what we could have done on our own. And I would say that by what we've seen so far, this does seem to be the case. So we have researchers from a variety of different backgrounds who have been working with our data. And I guess I would just note that so far it seems to be mainly in this last category. So users of our data tend to be more engineering leaning, and it seems that the ready to use data has been really useful for people who want to go right into the analysis stage. I'll also note that while we've been doing this for a little while, I don't think we're doing it perfectly. So we still have areas where we can improve. I'll just point out that the data curation and release, it does take time and it does take organization. So we acknowledge that, we can always do a better job. We often, in our documentation, are contacted by people later asking for additional details that we failed to include initially. In terms of data standards, the neuroimaging field does have standards for data release, and we're not quite there yet. And also, once you release data, you need to be ready to answer people's emails when they ask you questions. And apologies if you're here and I haven't answered your email, please don't hesitate to write back, and we'll get back to you. But on the plus side, with each data set that we release, we continue to refine our process and improve our process. And I think we've kind of reached a point where we know what to do and when. And so it does get a little faster and easier each time. And I will say that the adoption of the data so far is very encouraging, and it makes us want to continue doing this in the future. So in conclusion, I guess I'll just kind of aim it forward to the future. If you found this talk interesting and are thinking about releasing more research data yourself, here are just a few suggestions on how to get started. So first, check your administrative boxes. If you're an academic researcher, this probably means talking to your IRB or your ethics board about releasing data. If it's anonymized data, it's typically easier than if you're trying to release data that's linked to someone's identity. In an industry setting, you really want to be proactive in talking with the company. If you're thinking about releasing their data, they'll probably need to check some things, such as their terms of service. You need to make sure that you're not releasing sensitive company information to the public. They'll probably want to talk more about licensing. And then there might also be some conversations about who the data release is attributed to. For instance, whether it's to the researcher leading the project or to the company. Second, I would say, it's hard to anticipate who will use the data. It's hard to cover every use case, but a good way to start is just to identify your first audience, understand their needs, and make sure that you're giving that first audience what they need to use your data. An important point is to factor the data curation and documentation into the project timeline. So one of our collaborators currently estimates that doing these types of releases adds about 20% of added effort in the analysis stages of a project. And so it's important to just be ready for that and also figure out when to do the data curation. So what we've eventually come to do is we actually prepare and curate the data set between the cleaning and the analysis. And what this means is that when we proceed with our analyses, we're actually working on the exact data that will ultimately be released. And this has turned out to be faster than curating the data at the end and then having to go back and make sure that everything lines up with what we were analyzing. Also, help people cite you. So if you're going through the effort of releasing data, if you want people to use your data, you should really make it a contribution that can be cited. So we currently, using Stanford's digital repository, we have standalone citation and permanent URL for all of our data sets. We're in the process of adding the digital object identifiers. And it's important to also include a license with every data set so that people know, how they can use it, whether they should give attribution. With industry data sets in particular, the company may want to attach like a non-commercial clause to it so that people are only using their data for research. Be ready to answer correspondence and maintain the data set. So a data set's curational efforts do not end when you release the data. You'll probably continue to be involved with that data set for some time. And I would say, it's always good to write a README just so people can use it. If you give people the information they need up front, you won't have to answer as many emails, and it'll also result in more usage of your data and better for science overall. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening to me talk about research data. I think it's a really exciting topic, and I'm now happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions either in person or by typing to the chat?
Yeah, I have a question, Blair. Thank you very much for your talk. Very exciting initiative, and I appreciate the added time that's required to clean the data and get it ready for use by other people. Have you thought about misuse of data and possible ways to stem that? Is that something that you include in a license that limits the uses of that data, or how do you get around that?
So we're well, I guess there's a few things. So we use pretty basic licenses, at least for the EEG data. So it's typically like a CC BY or like an MIT license. I think we have like a CC0 license for something. And we also don't release, so we also try to mitigate misuse, at least in the human subjects realm, by not releasing much information about the participants, such as like their demographic information or their musical training. The industry data sets tend to be more restrictive in their licensing. So that's kind of how we've addressed that. But I'm also wondering if I am not clued into exact misuses of data that you might be referring to.
Yeah, one example, and it's not MIR related, is that another faculty member at Stanford has been showing how dating profiles and Facebook profiles can be used to infer whether a particular person is gay or straight, liberal or conservative, and has released data that supports the claims in the journal articles. And this could be used to increase the power of predictive systems and other places. So uses that aren't interested in answering fundamental questions, but in developing products that could be potentially damaging to society.
Oh, okay. I guess maybe I'll pose it as a question back to you of if we're not looking too much at demographic factors in our research, and if the release data has no information about that, does that itself mitigate misuse?
Yeah, I think these things should be constantly under review,
Mm-hmm.
and that a data set once released need not be permanently released, but could be retracted due to unforeseen factors.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, and it's making me think of some requests that we've received to release more information about the listeners that we've elected not to do so far, which makes me
Yeah,
think we'll kind of
how
leave that out.
when you do receive such questions, is it you that fields the questions, or is it Mary or the group? It's posed to the group. How are such requests handled?
So usually I end up receiving the request, and then when appropriate, I'll discuss it with the faculty who are involved with the group.
Yeah, these are not easy questions, not at all.
Can I jump in? I mean, this idea of retracting data, isn't that kind of futile? I mean, my kind of notion is that once the data is released, then that's it. I mean, you can try and delete it, but there might be copies existing, none of them and out of your control. So it seems that retracting data is fairly tricky, no?
Well, I guess I've seen retracted preprints, which isn't quite the same thing, but there was a preprint that I remember I was following with great interest, and then I went to the archive page one day and it said it had been retracted, and that the researchers asked that people not use the work for anything. So I agree that once someone has downloaded your data, you can't make them give it back to you. But and Bob, you might know more about data set retraction than me, but I would guess if there's a statement asking that people stop using the data, that might impact the success of other people who try to publish with it.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a data set blacklist that says institution or conferences or journals that are considering work for publication. If any of the data used is from that blacklist, then the authors must substitute in another data set. But I don't know of any such mechanism for any journal that I know of. So it's the same with publications. Once it's published at ISMIR or other places, being able to retract that publication is sort of a lost battle. It keeps getting cited again and again. So
Yeah, and I think your question in general kind of highlights this tension between trying to make a rich set of data available to people while, while avoiding those kinds of risks. Because, I know that if I release all of the information that I have along with the data set, like people could probably do really interesting things with it, but I don't think we can even do that.
Can I ask one of the kind of, well, maybe it's a kind of, it's a much narrower question than Bob's, but when you are when you're releasing music-related data, does the database include the specific music that people were listening to? And I presume some of it is copyright. So how do you handle that? And how do you allow people to kind of put these things together if you don't hold the copyright?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, we cannot release commercially available recordings with our data sets, which is essentially at odds with our research, which is all about using real world music. So we've gone about it a few ways. So firstly, if we have a control stimulus that is composed by us or is completely like divorced from the original content, we might release that just as a WAV file. Otherwise, what we try to do is give sufficient metadata information that another researcher could go and retrieve the exact recording that we were working with. Along with that, we might release like if there was one data set where we had trimmed a little bit of content from the beginning and the end of the recording. So I think we gave like the sample numbers of the recording that we included along with the metadata link. And then otherwise, we would just have the researcher contact us if they're trying to work with something that doesn't fit in any of those categories. And I know this is a question that comes up in MIR research a lot because it's, there's a lot of data that you can't completely work with if you don't have the audio.
there is a bit of a black market of data sets in MIR. A lot of my students say, do you know somebody who has this data set, a million song data set? Because you can't download the audio anymore. And I say, yeah, I do know someone. I send an email and a memory stick arrives.
Oh,
So,
do you mean the audio from which the data set
Yeah.
was computed?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
but no further details will be, oh no, it's recorded. This is recorded. Oh boy.
Do we have any other questions from anyone?
I guess I'm actually curious to know, like, if anyone else here has been kind of doing a lot of data release, and if there's anything I can learn from others in this session.
The data information sheets that Timit Gubru was describing, I find that to be a very good practice. I haven't actually employed that yet, but I think that's important to include with data and a version control system. There's also work with Magdalena Fuentes at NYU where they're creating a system that can compare the data set that you have that is supposedly the data set that was used in this paper XYZ, and their repository compares your data against the data set used in that other paper to determine if it is the same and if there are differences between it. So that could be an interesting tool. It's developed at Juan Bayo's research group.
Okay.
And Brian McPhee, yeah.
Is that across data sets that are purported to be the same or?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And you don't share the actual data, you're just sharing your ground truth or the features that you compute against a protected copy of the actual data set used in that paper.
Okay.
I'm not sure if they've published anything on that yet. She just presented the stuff to my research group, that topic,
Okay.
last week.
This is about people purporting to, the case that someone purports to use some data set, but actually used a different data or something.
Yeah.
That's the kind of case
Yeah.
that the kind of the halo of they used a data set that has a halo that's supposed to be give the results some validity, and actually it isn't.
That's right. And there could be corrupted, missing files. The text encoding may have been corrupted across different platforms. So a whole variety of things could go wrong with copying data from device to device.
Do we have any other question? Oh yeah, Nicola, you have a question. Great.
Hi. Hello. Thanks so much, Blair. That was really interesting talk. And I just wondered whether, are there any instances where, you kind of felt this, where you decided not to release data open access? So in other words, is there a kind of pattern of when one might not choose to do it, apart from the obvious things about data collection going wrong or something? Yeah, I wondered if you could say something about why those particular projects were released, for instance.
Yeah, so we have had some conversations around cases where it might become more challenging for like privacy and confidentiality reasons. So one case is if we're working with, so typically for my core research, I'm just interested in like general adults who listen to music, but there might be other cases where the data are just inherently more sensitive. So for instance, if you're collecting data from patients, or if you're collecting data from people who might kind of fall into more vulnerable populations by nature of some kind of diagnosis, or by being a child or something like that. Like, I think those are just generally more complicated settings, although we haven't directly encountered those yet. And another case is in our user research, we collect survey responses, some of which can be like free text. So people might write a little bit, or they might write quite a lot. And we had, let's see, we had one paper that came out a couple of months ago where it was just kind of like terse survey responses. And we had to kind of release the data, and that was fine. But we have some other projects where people were giving like very detailed responses with kind of personal reflections and motivations, and that one we're feeling like a little less sure, like even though it would still be anonymous, we don't know their identities ourselves, but I think in the qualitative research, it's become a little more or less clear cut for us on what to do.
Thanks. I mean, anecdotally, sorry, can I just carry on? Anecdotally, I've been surprised by how unbothered people are actually about if you say, you know, we now ask people to, you know, give consent and permission to make their data open access, anonymized or otherwise, depending on the project. And actually, I've been really surprised in a way at how participants, informants, don't seem to be particularly bothered. It's very rare that I've met an informant or participant who objects to it, but I don't know to what extent that's to do with, yeah, I'm not quite sure why that is, why people aren't perhaps more bothered, but yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of our consent forms does have parts where they could check off if they're okay with having their identity revealed, and we've also noticed that people are generally okay with it. Although we still haven't released data with identifiers on it.
Yeah.
I think we are about out of time. So very much thank you to Blair for starting her day very early. And thank to everybody who attended, and we'll see you in a month's time for the next seminar.